So when you talk about cemeteries and you talk about building next to cemeteries, obviously we've seen two right here so far that are built around. And we have a lot more cemeteries you could look at as far as examples, not only here in the York area, but elsewhere. So the question is, what's the problem when you want to do some building next to a cemetery? I mean, aside from digging up graves and running a highway through that, which you're not doing, and you're not disrespecting the cemetery in any way, shape, or form, it seems like there's some landmines here that we're looking at right now that people just want to kind of lay for you in terms of making it hard to do that. Why would you want to do that, again, when you can have tax-paying properties right there that are going to be helping the community in the long run?
Yeah, that going back in time, and I'll give you the short, long story of this whole project and this property. We had grown up going here to the cemetery. My grandparents are buried there, a couple of my aunts. But what's interesting about this is my uncle Dick and his dad, Dick Sr., actually worked this cemetery and maintained this cemetery for over 55 years.
Wow.
So growing up, when you go into their office, there's actually a picture of both of them. They were in the newspaper. So I have a lot of experience, a lot of history going in and out of the cemetery. And about 12 years ago, the owner of the cemetery, the previous owner, had come to me and I had went to him and had said, would you subdivide a piece of the property off that we can move our company here? So you have great access, it's a great location. And at that point, the deal kind of went a different direction. We couldn't really afford to do that at that point. I was always looking visionary into the future. But I learned a lot about the property then, going through the due diligence, what we were going to do. And it was actually this piece of property that we ended up purchasing about 11 years later. And we had met with the owner and looked at the property and said, hey, once it got rezoned, we thought it would be good use for industrial use. Right. So we got it rezoned to that. And the seller got it all rezoned, and then we had purchased this right after that. So we went into this with a property that was approved industrial, rezoned from residential to industrial. And at that point, there was no public pushback. There was no negativity. That sat there for a year. And for a year, it just sat there, approved industrial site. We never submitted any land development plans. And then what we did was we got hooked up with an industrial broker, and he dripped out a little bit of information. And it was all, a potential warehouse, whereas we had no plans for the property, just was rezoned industrial. What we didn't realize was how wanted and sought after that location would be for industrial property. And we actually went back to the zoning hearing board that ended up, blowing this all up. And the zoning hearing board, being rezoned industrial, actually gave us a reduced setback because it was beside a cemetery. And kind of one of the jokes through the conversations were, I don't think the neighbors are going to put up any of a fight, not much of a fight.
Right.
And we don't take that lightly because we understand the emotional, and the spiritual, everything that's tied to a family member that passes away.
It's not disrespectful at all in any way, shape, or form. Yeah.
And that's one thing that Jeff and I were very, very conscious about the whole way through the design of what we were designing on the property. And we didn't want to come in here, do something that wouldn't fit the area. So we had a tastefully designed, totally separate entrance, brand new entrance for the cemetery, separate entrance for this industrial parcel. And then this small Facebook group came out that kind of painted everything in a bad light. Stopped the warehouse groups. And as we discussed before, the NIMBYs came out, not in my backyard.
Right.
So that whole process was then about another year and a half of going back and forth of fighting the zoning. And when we were going through that, what sucked is we had a Fortune 50 company ready to come and build a manufacturing facility on this property. And because of an NDA, I can't explain who it is, I can't tell you who it is.
Right.
But it was somebody similar to like a Harley Davidson or a Caterpillar. And what Jeff and I were thinking as we, creating communities and we're trying to grow jobs, make the area better, it would have provided $35 to $45 an hour jobs, good high paying jobs, full benefits. And they really wanted to do a manufacturing facility here. It was one of their large endeavors. They love the location. They love the access to the city for workers being able to get there for public transportation. Not having to drive there would have cut down the transportation cost. So it lined up perfectly. We went from an LOI to a contract, and they got wind in their due diligence that there was going to be a contest against the zoning. So somebody was going to dispute the zoning, which turned out to be the Facebook group / the owner of the cemetery that purchased the cemetery after we purchased our parcel that connected to the cemetery. So he had known this was rezoned industrial. He had known this whole process. So he had purchased the cemetery. So then it became a legal battle. And for over a year and a half, we'd be in a legal battle with the zoning. And during that process, we lost that tenant that was going to come there. Like I said, Fortune 50 company, traded on the NASDAQ, would have been a great, great improvement to this area, and got blown up from a small group of people. Back to my analogy where it's less than 1% of York County curbed a development project that would have gotten a Fortune 50 company to come there.
And again, what's the main reason that they did that?
The only thing was proximity to the cemetery.
Yeah,
And that was the only reason that they were shooting it down.
So the idea is you could build it next to somebody else's cemetery or build it next to someone else's property or in someone else's place, but not here. Not here because we don't want it to be here.
And
not because you're disrupting anything, not because you're using another same entrance, not because you're sharing the same property or you're doing anything in a desecrating type way. Just we don't want it here.
Yeah, and that's when we were looking at this property. For years and years and years, we dreamed of what could go there. And when you take a map and you zoom out of an area,
right,
and you're like, what could be good to develop? You look at the school districts, you look at taxes, you look at your access to utilities. You take all that information to put it together, and you say, okay, there's a finite amount of land that you can develop in this core area. And when we zoomed in, I was like, well, this has been sitting here for years. When we met with the original owner, I asked him, I said, what's the reason why you wouldn't just keep this as a cemetery,
right,
and expand into this open area? And he said, John, we've done studies and studies and studies, and we've actually got to see them, that the amount of people to the tune of 70% of burials today are cremations. Mm-hmm. So they're going to mausoleums. They're not even going directly into the ground in direct burials. That was a thing of the past. And he said, given our timeline of how many burials we've done each year for the last 30 years, it would take us another 112 years to develop this cemetery, all of our direct burials, 112 years. He said, John, he's like, if that increases to 75, 80%, he said, I'd beat 150 years. So there was really no reason to hold this land outside of just holding the land.
Right.
So from that standpoint, it just made sense. Sell the property, put it into good use, a tax base, providing jobs. And that's what led us down the road to be able to develop it as an industrial site instead of doing anything else.